The Super Bowl is just days away as the Chiefs look to defend their title against the 49ers. Meanwhile, Seattle's first new head coach in 14 years is preparing to build out the rest of his staff. Esteemed beat reporter Bob Condotta joins us to preview the big game and lend his insight into the new era of Seahawks football. Let's light him up. I'm Jacson Bevins, and this is Cigar Thoughts. Welcome back to the Cigar Lounge. I am Jacson Bevins, and along with my vascular producer, Mike Barwin, this is the Cigar Thoughts podcast. Mike, how are we doing today?
Doing great, man. It's Super Bowl week. We're drinking the Haterade. We're ready for an awesome, unbelievable matchup, and the Seahawks are filling out their first completely top-down new coaching staff in 14 years. So, a lot going on. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing great, man. It's exciting times as a football fan. It's exciting times as a Seahawks fan, and I cannot wait to talk more about it with Bob. But first, if you're listening or watching us right now, it's hopefully because you like the show. And if you like the show, there are a few ways you can support it. If you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, take a couple of seconds to leave us a 5-star rating. And if you're feeling super supportive, a quick review as well. You can do that right now. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you'll find full video episodes, entertaining clips, and the audio reads of every Cigar Thoughts article. This is probably the best way to help the show grow, and growth is going to enable us to bring more of our football discourse your way. So we're grateful for the few seconds it takes to like and subscribe. And, as always, you can get your official Cigar Thoughts cigars at cigarthoughtsnfl.com. Now, last week, Mike, you and I got to react on the show shortly after the news of Mike Macdonald's hiring broke, and it ended up being one of our most watched episodes. The feedback was great, and I really enjoyed getting your thoughts on the matter, but we were missing a key ingredient, and that was the perspective of someone from inside the building. Today, we rectify that situation as we welcome the Godfather of the Seahawks beat. He is one of the most prolific reporters in the sport, with his name appearing in hundreds of bylines per year for the Seattle Times. He is Bob Condotta. Bob, thanks for coming in.
Sure, yeah. How you guys doing?
We're great, man. Better now that you're here. How's the last week been for you?
Yeah, I mean, the whole last month really was kind of crazy with, really starting that last Sunday. I mean, I can't say any of us knew for sure that was going to be Pete on the way out, but there was you definitely knew that it was a better than zero chance down in Arizona that when they didn't make the playoffs that something might happen. And, so from that point until, I guess, Thursday when they introduced Mike Macdonald, it's just kind of been your life's on hold a little bit the whole time because you're waiting first to see what they're going to do with Pete. And then when they do that, then you're waiting to see who they're going to hire. And obviously the NFL rules made it I'd never covered an NFL head coaching change before, right? Because Pete had stayed so long.
Yeah.
And, if you cover Jacksonville or something, this is like something you do every year. But
Jaguars just catching strays to start the show. I love it.
They're trying to think, Carolina, I guess. Carolina has been doing these left and right. But I covered University of Washington for a long time, but during that time they did. But a lot of times college searches like theirs this year took about 12 minutes from when DeBoer left to when they hired. You can do that in college, and you sort of need to because of recruiting. But in the NFL, it's a little different. You don't necessarily have to rush your coach hire, and the NFL doesn't want you to. So yeah, it was kind of a long month there.
Yeah,
just kind of looking at your phone constantly to see what's going on.
Yeah. I actually do want to rewind a month to New Year's Eve when the Seahawks, I don't know how else to put it, certainly on defense, just got embarrassed by the Steelers with a playoff berth essentially on the line. And I think for Mike and I, that's when our antenna started to go up that, maybe it's not going to be Pete's call about his future, because I've long operated under the assumption that, Carroll's going to coach in Seattle for as long as he wants to. And that clearly wasn't the case. You mentioned that, after that Arizona game, you started to kind of wonder what gave you that sense. Is it just, hey, they missed the playoffs, so he's vulnerable, or was there something else that you were picking up on?
Well, no, I agree with you about the Pittsburgh game. I mean, the Pittsburgh game I thought changed I mean, I don't know if anybody would ever say that quite that bluntly, but I thought the Pittsburgh game changed a lot because up until that point, you could excuse a lot of, they're not better than the 49ers and Baltimore and stuff like that. Some of those other losses you could sort of excuse a little bit. But, when they won those back-to-back games against Philly and Tennessee, and I thought, man, if they get to 10 wins and they make the playoffs, you can't really argue that. So, the Pittsburgh loss. So I am kind of meaning more that, I guess, but just definitely at Arizona, there was this sort of that, if you're going to make a change, this might be a time that it makes sense to do it. And is everybody getting a little bit restless here that they seem to have plateaued this year as opposed to last year? They didn't take that step forward. So it was more just that.
They basically lost that Arizona game. Also. So, by all intents and purposes.
Yeah, no, for sure. They didn't play better. That's a really fair point. That in a game they I think they felt. I think everybody was feeling fairly ominous about that. Like the Packers aren't losing, but still, the Seahawks, as they all said, we got to go take care of our business, and they didn't look like they were doing that for most of that game. You're right, and Arizona kind of just Arizona'd that. I mean, that's what Arizona's been doing a lot the last few years. But and then Matt Prater of all people. I mean, one of the better kickers in NFL history, and
that FanDuel account's leaking soon.
So for sure, it was a weird vibe all the way around. And the cigar smoking thing afterward was just kind of strange too. It just felt kind of weird there. And as everybody pointed out, we all played the clip of Pete, and I think he said for now, right? When he was asked how he felt about coming back, Pete was always weird about his contractual situation, even going back. It's easy to forget the Super Bowl year. He was going into the next year was going to be his last year. And so even during when they were winning the Super Bowl, it was a tiny bit of an issue because he only had 1 year on his contract. And even then he was always squirrely about talking about it. So part of me didn't know, well, maybe that's just Pete being Pete, or was that really I don't know what's going on. But, when they didn't schedule their end of the year press conference by Wednesday, I think we all sort of knew something was happening, and exactly what that something was, we didn't know for sure. But I kicked myself a tiny bit. I should have written a story for that Wednesday, maybe saying that, but it's still hard to know. Maybe they didn't schedule the press conference because Pete had to have go to the dentist or something.
Sure,
so you never knew for sure. But I will say my own antenna, that Tuesday night when we didn't get we're gonna talk to Pete tomorrow kind of thing, because how it always was with Pete. They'd have the meetings, and then he would head to Hawaii, and and he would always talk about during the press conference, like, you guys got like 10 more minutes, and then I'll see you in 6 weeks or whenever the combine rolls around. And it just felt different this year.
Totally. Well, I want to transition to the lead story here. Mike Macdonald's taken over for Pete Carroll as the head coach of the Seahawks. This was to the delight of most Seahawks fans. But what was your initial reaction when you heard the news, and how surprised were you that it ended up being Mike McD?
Well, it's another thing that I wasn't Nostradamus at all. By the time it happened, I wasn't surprised, just because of the route that it all took, and that they were waiting. And, if it was going to be Dan Quinn, it could have been Dan Quinn, 2 weeks earlier or whatever. Yeah. So, once it kind of wasn't that, and you knew they were really casting a broad net, you got the feeling much more that, maybe that was part of the thing here, was to really take a shot on kind of a younger, not unknown, but certainly unproven from a head coaching standpoint. You never know for sure what you're going to get in a coach that hasn't coached, and so we still don't know. But I think I think maybe they felt like that was the time to do something like that. Maybe you really do get the next. That obviously he's a defensive guy, so the comparison isn't exactly the same. But the next Sean McVay or Kyle Shanahan or whatever, that guy who is just sort of the prodigy, the young prodigy who can completely remake one side of the ball. And so the longer it took, the less surprised I was by that standpoint. But I can't say on the day it happened that I thought it was going to be him. Although we did include him, I think, in our 5 guys it could be kind of thing, or whatever. I mean, his name was kind of out there the whole time, obviously.
Sure. And this is not a hold your feet to the fire question here, but did you get the sense that it was Macdonald the whole time, is like, this is our number one with the bullet? Or is it like either him or Ben Johnson? Because he was kind of the other one that teams were waiting on, and they kept winning, And so everybody else was kind of filling out their spot. And this is something we talked about last week. I think one of the benefits to Seattle when it came to this coaching search is most teams that are looking for a new head coach don't have a general manager that's been in place for 14 years. And as a result, these other teams are having to figure out, okay, how are we going to approach free agency? How are we going to approach the draft? We got to get the staff in place so that we can put together a game plan. Whereas nothing about this process is going to be new for Seattle, even with the new head coach, outside of, maybe different priorities in terms of what types of players that are being brought in. So they had the luxury of being able to wait, much like the Colts did. I was always really impressed by how the Colts approached it last year. They were willing to wait for Shane Steichen. Did you get the sense that it was Mike Macdonald the whole way? Or was there a sense that, maybe it's Ben Johnson or someone else that we're waiting for too?
Yeah, well, and to your point, you're exactly right. And that's where the comparison between like the NFL and college, and you had John and the personnel team, they're there the whole time. So they're doing all that. They're doing all their, they had guys down at the Senior Bowl while all this was going on, who are doing the regular work that needs to be done this time of year, which is the kind of work that Pete Carroll wasn't, the head coaches don't necessarily always do that or whatever. So, but, they had other people that were there to do that. So you're right. They had that luxury of time. It's interesting. There were the 8 jobs, but then, 2 went immediately. The Raiders and Patriots just hired in-house. And, I think John read that part of it quickly that, who is just kind of like your draft board of who are these other teams going to hire. And once you realize, we can tell that some of these other teams are going to hire this other guy that we're not going to hire anyway. And so that's when it does come. It's the 2 or 3 of us that are left hiring the same, going after the same 2 or 3. I sort of felt going into that last week that Dan Quinn was just sort of, I don't mean this to sound the way it might sound, but he was sort of the whole card, the guy you knew, I think, you could get the whole time. So like the worst you were going to do was Dan Quinn. And that's where you waited with Ben Johnson and Mike Macdonald to be able to talk to those guys and really give it a fair shot and to look at those guys. Then you're taking a little bit of a gamble there with Dan that someone else would up and hire him or whatever, if that really was your thought. But I think they felt just kind of reading that between the lines, it just sort of felt that way, that was what they, I think, thought they could always sort of do is fall back to that if everything else sort of fell through. So I think they really wanted to have a fair look at each of those guys. So John, it was interesting to me how frank John Schneider was about saying, well, we wanted both Detroit and Baltimore to lose so we could go talk to both these guys. I think they wanted to talk to both of them. I think they hadn't talked to Mike Macdonald yet at all. And so I don't think they probably, why they wanted both of them to lose is I don't know that you wanted to hire maybe Ben Johnson or make a hire without ever being able to talk to Mike Macdonald. Mm-hmm. And so Baltimore had won. But then same thing, they at that point they hadn't talked to Mike Macdonald yet, so you might not want to go the route of being able to finally talk to Mike Macdonald, but then having to wait 2 more weeks before you could talk to Ben Johnson in person if that was what you wanted to do. So I think they were pretty open to both of those guys. I mean, it sounds like by all accounts it happened pretty fast with Macdonald after they talked to him, but which leads me to believe while it was still kind of open with him that whole time, it really wasn't until they talked to him in Baltimore that I think they really got to the whole point of, yeah, you might be the guy we want and vice versa.
Yeah. Well, tell me about now that he's been here for going on a week. What are your first impressions? Because to me, this feels like a Paul Allen hire. When Paul Allen was running the show, he wasn't afraid to take the big swings. He went out and he got Mike Holmgren when he was essentially the Andy Reid of 20 years ago. And then he took the big swing on Pete Carroll and got the hottest college name in the game to come here. And I was wondering, okay, Jody is at the end of the day pulling these strings. Is she going to take the big swing or, play it safe? Dan Quinn kind of being the placeholder for the guy who's been there, done it before, is familiar with how Seattle operates, all that kind of stuff. Talk to me about your first impressions a week into Mike Macdonald being here.
Yeah, well, what's interesting, obviously, I mean, if you look back through the entire history of the franchise, though, they've always sort of taken big swings, but on sort of proven guys, right? Even go back to Chuck Knox, who was like a 3-time NFL Coach of the Year honor, and Dennis Erickson, Tom Flores, who'd won Super Bowls, Dennis Erickson, who was coming off a couple of college national titles, and was a really popular name locally, because he was from here and he coached at Washington State and stuff like that. And then Holmgren, and then Pete. You could hardly have gotten kind of the bigger name, more of who was logically available at the time they made those hires. Those were as big a guys as there was that was available at those times. So this is a little different from that standpoint. It's a little bit more of a gamble with a guy who's never been a head coach before. The only guy who's never been a head coach in team history other than, Jack Patera, the first guy they hired.
Sure.
He, we obviously got the podium session that all you guys saw. And then they actually had about a 10 or 15 minute session that was sort of off the record-ish, but where all the beat writers got to go just talk to him for about 10 minutes or so after that. And which was interesting because
does he have a good handshake?
Yeah, he does. Yeah, he does appear to have one. Although I think he did it right-handed because there's been all this he signed. So I asked him about that, and he's like goofy-handed, like he does some things left-handed and some things right-handed. And
yeah.
He was trying to explain it. So he's because I think he signed his contract with his left hand, and everybody saw that. But he throws a football, I think, with his right hand. He struck me as very kind of self-assured and I think very businesslike. I think that's one of the things they really like about him is I don't think there's any concern at all about what his approach to this job will be and sort of putting in the necessary effort and all that kind of stuff. I think they feel like this is a guy who's really proven that, that he's kind of a coaching lifer and a grinder and all that as a head coach. But yeah, he, when we did get a chance to talk to him a little bit separately, he just he came off as very sort of down to earthish, and he was just kind of like, okay, you're the ones that I'm going to have to be, we're going to be together an awful lot. You guys are the ones who are going to be out here every day and all that, and it was interesting, that just kind of from a few of those interactions with him and from other things you hear about him, just this is a guy I think he was sort of born to coach and. That's sort of come through in the really rapid rise he's been able to make from, it's crazy that, basically he's coaching high school kids on a volunteer basis in college. And then, while Pete Carroll's winning the Super Bowl with the Seahawks, he's in college himself, right, at the time and doing that. And being a graduate assistant at Georgia and everything. It's really happened fast for him. So, it's impossible to really judge much yet from the coaching or how he's going to interact with players kind of standpoint, other than what we've seen other places. But that's always everybody will tell you that's the biggest change you make is from coordinator to head coach. And, every other step of the way, the responsibilities change a little bit here and there. But when you go from coordinator to head coach, which is every once in a while someone does it without being a coordinator, but typically that's what you do.
Right.
And, that's the biggest, kind of challenge and difference in how you approach things that you have to make. And that's still kind of an X factor where you never know for sure how a guy's going to do that. But certainly just from afar, just the way he handles himself, again, he seems like a very organized, kind of detailed guy, which in football is so important. He seems to definitely kind of check all the boxes in all those ways.
Yeah, you mentioned that initial podium session he had. What stood out to you about his opening press conference? Because from my standpoint, it definitely didn't come across as a bunch of canned responses like, this is what I'm supposed to say as a first-time head coach. It didn't seem like he played it safe.
No, I would agree with you. I thought some of his answers were interesting that way. And in terms of one of the things that struck me a little bit was how open-minded he seems to be. A lot of times guys could maybe like, this is the scheme I know worked where I was, and so this is exactly what we're doing. And he was much more of, you have to tailor the scheme to your players or to your playing each week and all that kind of stuff. And I thought a lot of that was sort of interesting because a lot of times guys are sort of maybe trying to sell themselves in those situations and like, this is why I'm going to be the good hire. And I didn't get that sense from him at all, that like he was trying to be up there and justify why he got the job or anything like that. I thought he was just sort of answering the questions the way he knew how to answer them. And, there wasn't any sort of, kind of chip on his shoulder or anything like that in that way. I just got the sense that this was just kind of who he was, and that's how he was presenting himself as that. But I thought, like his opening statement, again, to go back to that, I thought it was very, there were obviously some people he wanted to thank and some things he wanted to say and some things he wanted to get across. And it seemed in that standpoint that, that's, I mean, in his case, this is the first time he's ever had something like that really. As a coordinator, you usually do kind of an opening press conference, but it's nothing like that. Again, it seemed like it was kind of well thought out and organized what he wanted to say and the points he wanted to get across and all that. And, it wasn't like a real super rambling kind of thing or anything like that.
No, it felt like he had a game plan. And when you hear about his former players and people that coached with him, the thing that stands out to me as a consistent when they talk about what it was like working with Mike Macdonald is attention to detail. And so to me, that was consistent, right? Like that's what we saw in that press conference. He had really detailed answers. They weren't vague. They weren't big umbrella type statements like, yeah, we're here to win and instill a culture and all that kind of stuff that you might expect, especially from someone that's a first time coach. He had some really specific answers to some of your guys' questions. And I think, just as telling as what Macdonald said were some of the things John Schneider was saying. And, at one point Schneider said two things that really stood out to me. One was talking about his feelings after the Baltimore game, right? And talking with players who were just like, what the hell just happened? And feeling like, he didn't say this explicitly, but the sense I got was saying we were outcoached in that game. Like we didn't have answers in that game. And look, 37-3 or whatever it was, obviously a little self-reflection there. He said something else though, talking about Marty Schottenheimer telling him, you shouldn't coach in any place for more than 10 years. Was that a bit of a slip or an allusion to, do you feel like John Schneider feeling like maybe Pete was there a little too long?
Yeah, I wrote about both those things. In fact, I sort of let off my story the next day with kind of the whole Baltimore anecdote and tried to follow up with John a little bit about that because that definitely struck me when he said that about that. And that was a day. You'd never really ever seen a Carroll team look like that ever in the 14 years he was here, maybe other than that first year. But, even things like that Rams game that was so bad in 2017, but that was like some fluky plays. And, it ended up looking bad, but it wasn't, they didn't just seem, like you said, no answers to anything. But yeah, that Baltimore game, you didn't even felt like they played that well through some of that game, and yet then they win 37-3 and it's 515 yards to 151 and all that. So there's no doubt. I think looking at that, I think he did feel a little bit like with the talent he feels like that they've put together, it shouldn't look like that at this point in time. I've heard other coaches say that before. Other people in football say that there is just sort of a little bit of an expiration date on how long what you do works and how long your message works. Obviously, this team's had so much turnover, so the whole thing about is the message getting old. I wasn't sure I bought that with this year's team at all. There's so many young guys and all
pretty
that.
young roster overall.
Yeah, I don't know that anybody was like tuning Pete out. A lot of these guys have only been here a year or two, but just in general, can the rest of the league catch up to you a little bit in terms of what you do? And is that just when your team just kind of needs a new voice in every way, or just a new way of doing things? That can be true in a lot of different businesses, if not just coaching. But yeah, it was interesting when John said that, because I think I felt like that was about the biggest. He evaded a question basically when he was asked like, why did you do this? But then he did say that in one of the answers, and I thought that was kind of his answer to that a little bit, like they don't want to dump on Pete in any kind of way, but it's just more that maybe they just run its course. And we just kind of did finally feel like, this was the end of the road.
So given that, most teams that are hiring a new coach have not won 18 games in the previous 2 seasons, right? So it does make this a uniquely, I guess, attractive situation in that sense that a lot of the new coaching hires this year are going to be able to build the whole thing in their image for better or worse. Whereas there is a culture in place in Seattle There are wins in place in Seattle. There's not a ton of starting spots necessarily up for grabs next year. Given all of that, given that Pete's DNA was so closely interwoven into the DNA of this franchise, does Mike Macdonald feel like the right fit? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Well, and that's an interesting point, because I think in one way is when you ask why they make the change, because it's the old saying of you can't change all the personnel. And then, as you rightly point out, they do have an awful lot of people in place in spots, and especially if they can re-sign some of their guys, where it's like we don't want to. We don't want to change all the personnel. So the one thing you can change is the coaching. Macdonald obviously got a week to look, especially at the offense anyway, to look at Seattle's offense. So the one value of them having played this year is he obviously would have had a pretty good, and that was in November as well. So that, pretty much the team that it was at the end of the year. So he did get a look at spend a week kind of looking at him that way, the way the coordinators do. So he does sort of know what he's stepping into here a little bit personnel wise. I don't profess to be such a big X's and O's guy that I can tell for sure that what he did with Baltimore is going to be a better look for what they do here. But I do just think that having a fresh set of what I sort of feel like is having a fresh set of eyes on a lot of these guys, I think that could really help. I think one of Pete's strengths was the way he could attach to these guys emotionally and mentally and things like that. But I think that was always the thing sometimes of, it can be hard to let go a little bit too, maybe, right? Like you really like this guy personally, or, so-and-so has done so much for you as a player and things like that. And when you just have a new guy come in and kind of look at everything, in kind of a fresh way, but then he's also coming from what's a very successful program in Baltimore. So
Yes.
he knows sort of he has a background in an NFL setting that has worked really well, but then he's also coming at it from the outside, and he's not emotionally invested in anybody on the team. I feel like that's something that could probably be really healthy for this team right now, is just sort of taking a real fresh look at a lot of different things that way. And that's why I'll be really curious to see what kind of moves they make personnel wise between, that nothing would happen, I don't think, in the next few weeks, but before free agency, and so that kind of that couple week period between the combine and free agency, to me, will be really interesting to see if they make some significant moves at that point.
Totally. And no one's going to hold you ultra accountable to whatever your opinions on the hire are before they've played any games. But, being a head coach is more than just the X's and O's stuff like you talked about. I mean, you are the de facto CEO of a $5 billion corporation, where even CEOs of Fortune 500 companies aren't necessarily subject to the scrutiny week in and week out that head coaches are. I truly believe it's one of the most challenging positions in the country. One of the big decisions he's going to have to make is regarding offensive coordinator. Macdonald mentioned in that initial presser that he's going to start calling out the plays. He's going to start out by calling the plays on defense, and won't really consider delegating that until he feels supremely comfortable in whoever his defensive coordinator is. And that makes it a little easier to get a sense of the intended identity for Seattle on that side of the ball, though he was careful to acknowledge that he's going to figure out what the team's strengths are before full implementation of the scheme. And I actually like that. He wasn't just saying like, yeah, this is a 1-for-1. What I do works, and we're going to make that happen. The allusion to, I'm not necessarily going to force, a square peg into a round hole, was encouraging for me. But that leaves the vacancy at offensive coordinator as the next big plot development for the Seahawks offseason. What are you hearing about that aspect of the search? And do you get a sense regarding what type of offensive approach Macdonald and Schneider are after?
Yeah, well, and I'm glad you mentioned Schneider there, because, John did make clear to us that, he sort of now has final say on the coaching staff as well, which is not something he had prior. So
Of course.
I don't think he would, I don't think you would hire Mike Macdonald and then say, but you're going to have to take whatever coordinator I want, regardless of if you like it. I think,
but it's fair to say it's rare for a GM to be the one filling out the coaching staff, right? I mean, a lot of times the head coach has the bigger influence on who's going to be coaching with him.
Yeah. But it did kind of strike me a little bit when he said that, because I guess you wonder somewhat about some of the coordinator hires maybe they've made the last few years, that maybe John maybe wanted to go a different direction or something like that. And especially obviously, as we saw with the defense, they always just sort of promoted from within largely, and which I think was, kind of Pete being really loyal to his guys and stuff like that a little bit. So I mean, as we're doing this, I mean, I don't know any names other than the two that have kind of been out there, Ryan Grubb and Tanner Engstrand, and the Ryan Grubb is obviously a really interesting name, and we all saw locally what he did, but there's always that question of the college to the NFL. How much does that work? And then Kalen DeBoer obviously is kind of a real offensive guy himself. So there's always that question of separating the coordinator from the head coach in those kind of situations of whose system is it really, and who's really the guy calling the shots. Obviously, someone has to call the plays on game day, but that was always a thing with Pete. I thought with Pete, the defensive coordinators with the Seahawks, it was always a little bit hard to know of exactly how much freedom the coordinator really had on anything, because I think the perception was always that
very fair.
That nothing happened with the defense that Pete wasn't ultimately signing off on. And then Tanner Engstrand's an interesting guy because, it sounds like, they just kind of, there was a big assumption in Detroit that Ben Johnson was probably going to get a head coaching job, and then he was just going to be promoted to be the offensive coordinator to take his place. And so now maybe he's looking around to potentially be leaving a little bit, but that's the same thing where, he's the passing game coordinator there, but obviously working for an offensive coordinator who's getting a lot of credit. So, how much responsibility or say has he really been having in things? But he has a tie to the Harbaugh family from way back, from having coached under Jim Harbaugh. So that's where the kind of some comfort with Macdonald, I'm sure would fit in there in terms of having that experience, kind of that background. So. Both of them would be interesting choices. Obviously, Ryan Grubb would be very interesting just because we did get to know him well, from a football standpoint, watching what he did at Washington the last couple of years, and just kind of seeing if he'd be able to kind of translate that to the NFL level.
Yeah, before this show, Mike and I were chatting about the potential offensive coordinator candidates, and maybe there's some names outside of this list that are being considered that we need to be more aware of. But you mentioned two of them with Ryan Grubb and Tanner Engstrand. The other two that kind of seem to be floating around are Chip Kelly and Eric Bieniemy. And Mike, I'm actually curious. Mike has this really good intuition with the Seahawks. It's one of the things that I really appreciate about doing this show with him. Mike, as you look at those four coordinators, and I know that you've done some real legwork on each of them, who kind of stands out to you, and what do you like or not like about each of those four guys?
I'll preface this by saying that the New York Giants blocked the option of another Mike at OC for the Seahawks, which is kind of a bummer.
Can't let Team Mike get too strong, man.
Exactly. We were amassing a lot of power within the organization, so they had to put a stop to that. But I mean, like Bob said, Tanner Engstrand, he started out as, I want to say, a graduate assistant at University of San Diego before ascending to assistant head coach and play caller there. Ryan Grubb, he's been with Kalen DeBoer for a long time. He is the only guy that in 25 years of calling plays in Kalen DeBoer's career, I think Grubb is the only guy that he's felt comfortable handing off those play calling duties to. Mm-hmm. So a lot of us had a close-up look at Grubb in his time at Washington. Chip Kelly is an odd one because Chip Kelly and Eric Bieniemy are the only two guys in that group of four that have NFL experience calling plays. Tanner Engstrand, he was an OC, like I said, at San Diego, but also in the XFL with the DC Defenders with Cardale Jones. But outside of that, he's just been, game planning, pass game coordinator for the Lions and tight ends coach. And Ryan Grubb hasn't taken the leap to the league yet. What a meteoric ascent that would be over the last few years for him if he ended up as Seahawks OC. But Chip Kelly, he was fairly successful in Philadelphia as a head coach for a couple of seasons before the power struggle with Howie Roseman ultimately was lost. And then his one forgotten season in San Francisco after Jim Tom Sula. And then Eric Bieniemy, it's kind of the same thing that Bob was saying, where you're trying to try to divide up credit because he was with Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes. How much of the pie goes where, and so I think Chip Kelly might be more of a player than people want to believe right now. Maybe biased. I really like the idea of Grubb. And I think something that we need to consider also is Mike Macdonald saying that similar to the way that he's going to call the defense, where he's going to assess the roster and the players that they have before building the system around that, I don't think that he wants any of these guys, or Schneider for that matter, to come in and say, I run this type of offense. I run West Coast, or I run like these air raid concepts. I think Mike Macdonald made the statement that they want to build up a new sort of synthesized offense together and have that be something that builds and grows throughout time for a long time in the Pacific Northwest. So how much, I don't think that he was saying that they were necessarily putting NFL experience as a premium in that search either, which is interesting.
Totally. And it's something that I certainly respect. McDonald being a defensive guy, we're at this interesting crossroads philosophically with him, because traditionally defensive coaches have wanted ball control offenses, right? They're defensive guys, right? They care about the defensive stats. They don't necessarily want to be playing 13 or 14 possessions on defense. So it seems like pace is something that's always been really important to defensive minded head coaches. We saw it with Pete Carroll. The Seahawks were bottom 5th in plays run every single season. Even when they were winning a bunch, they didn't run a ton of plays on offense. They were slow getting out of the huddle. They were all about extending drives and winning on third down and all of these different things. And, Chip Kelly, for example, Eric Bieniemy too, famous for being fast, right? Minimal time in between plays, embracing no huddle, and being really, really aggressive on offense. Bob, do you get any sense yet from Mike Macdonald in terms of what it is that he's looking for there?
Not really. It was interesting, the answer he gave. I would preface that by remembering how the question was phrased, and the question was phrased that way of, is NFL play calling experience important to you? And it might have been asked by somebody who had an idea that Ryan Grubb might be a candidate for this. So,
Sure.
Always worth keeping that context somewhat in mind there. Chip Kelly, the one reason I would be somewhat skeptical of how much that might be a fit here is simply because of who he is and kind of what a strong personality he is, and with a 36-year-old guy who's never been a head coach before being the head coach, that might be an interesting dynamic. Obviously, they brought in Leslie Frazier to be the assistant head coach, and I think that might have been something that they sort of knew might be in the works when they did all this as well. When they hired Macdonald, and they might have had a decent feeling there that they could get that done with Leslie Frazier and sort of understand, we'll bring in somebody who has been a head coach and kind of has that background while we're hiring a head coach who's never been a head coach before. Throwing Chip Kelly into that would be, he's an interesting and pretty strong personality, and it would be a really interesting fit. But you're right, there seems to be this this idea that he just, he's down in UCLA and it's gone okay there, but not incredibly great. They ended the year nicely with the win over USC and all that, but that, maybe he wants out of college football with just UCLA's move into the Big Ten, and he's been pretty open about what a mess he thinks college sports is. So, maybe he'd be willing to take what kind of looks on paper like a step down. But I haven't, as we're doing this, I haven't heard anything connecting him to the job. And I'm sure John knows him from his NFL days and scouting and stuff like that. But I don't know how. I've never heard that they have a particularly strong relationship at all. Eric Bieniemy, yeah, you're 100% right. I mean that, and I think that was part of why. He kind of ended up going to Washington this year, was that idea maybe from both sides that it was time for him to sort of go off on his own a little bit and see what he could do on his own. And then, as could have maybe been predicted with the way the Washington franchise has gone, that didn't last real long, and Washington's sort of starting over there. But he would be an interesting choice, obviously, with that background of what he has. and seeing where that would go. But yeah, I especially with John Schneider sort of overseeing this a little bit. I mean, do you take the chance of a first-time head coach and a first-time offensive play caller kind of all at once? Obviously Macdonald called the defensive plays for 3 years if you include the Michigan year, but that goes from a really super experienced head coach and kind of overall staff to one where you'd have a lot of newness to it. But every great play caller, offensive play caller, Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan, whoever had a first game where they'd never called plays before. So you have to start somewhere. So it will be really interesting to see what they do there. But I think schematically, I mean, if you commit to Geno Smith, and I don't think they'll hire a coordinator without knowing what they're going to do with that. Obviously, that's the February 16th day when they have to guarantee his base salaries coming up. I imagine they're going to do that, and he's going to be on the roster. If I had to bet, that's the way I'd bet. But if you're going to have Geno Smith as your quarterback, that dictates quite a bit of what you're going to do offensively. I mean, you're going to. I don't know how totally different you could look other than what the Seahawks did in general with him. Obviously, there's a lot of different plays and stuff like that you could do, but I mean, you're not going to start running the Lamar Jackson offense or something like that with Geno at this stage. So,
well, let's talk about that a little bit. I'm actually glad that you brought it up because it is something I wanted to talk with you about. With John pulling the final string now, do you get the sense that actually, I'm going to back up one step here. When it came to personnel decisions, and let's just use Geno Smith as starting quarterback as a microcosm for this. What really was, now it's in the past, what really was that relationship between Pete Carroll and John Schneider when it came to personnel decisions?
I mean, I think for 99% of them, and on a regular day-to-day basis, I think it was as collaborative as they said. But I think there were some times when I think Pete wanted some things done sort of philosophically in some ways. There was sort of the idea that after a couple of the drafts where maybe they took a lot of risks on some guys, Pete wanted to rein that in a little bit and be a little more, let's make sure we're getting guys who can help us immediately. And I think there was always a little bit of a thought that Pete might have leaned a little bit more on veterans. Let's say trading for Carlos Dunlap at midseason instead of just letting a young guy kind of take those
good
steps.
Pull.
I think Pete was always sort of the win now guy, and so I think Pete would sometimes push things in that direction of I don't care about 3 years from now. So the draft and developing guys. I care about putting the best team we can on Sunday, and that's always the thing in all pro sports is the organization can often look more big picture with the people who know they're going to be around longer, where the coach is always like, if we lose Sunday, I might be getting fired.
That's right. So I'm so glad you touched on that. I'm so glad you touched on that because I think something that gets lost in the discourse is just how little job security almost every coach has. Right? Like Andy Reid has earned himself a down season. Hell, Bill Belichick earned himself 3 down seasons. Right? Like once you get to a certain level, John Harbaugh could win 5 games next year and probably earn benefit of the doubt. Mike Tomlin, a few of these guys, but most coaches are coaching for their livelihoods. This is life-changing money. Every year that they're a head coach in the NFL, they are setting their families up for success in a way that not being a head coach in the NFL does not allow them to do. Whereas the GM has to be thinking 2-3 years down the road. And then you step even further back from that, you look at ownership. And my thought is, when it comes to looking at who your general manager is, if you can't see them being the GM in 3 years, then they shouldn't be the GM for this year. Because they are going to be, the prism that the lens they're looking at their decision making through can't just be about winning right now, or else you get yourself in a position that's completely unsustainable. I'm curious, one of the things that I think might make this a really good marriage is Mike Macdonald just got a 6-year contract. He is not necessarily coaching for his job next year. In fact, I would venture to say he is definitely not coaching for his job next year. Now they go 3-14 or some outlier thing. Okay. Maybe it's a Jim Mora Jr. situation. You say, all right, 1 year, this isn't working. I don't think that's really the case here. It's got to be a little bit refreshing to Schneider to have a head coach that can also take a long-term view.
Yeah, well, in John's contract, so to remember, goes through the 2027 draft. So essentially three full seasons. So that's how I view it for sure. Is that this is it for 3 years? Is these two guys together running it? And there's obviously also the Jody Allen, we'll see or won't see sell the team eventually thing, but 2 or 3 years probably is.
Yeah, that's the thing behind the curtain.
Yeah, is sort of a maybe a little bit more of a realistic timeline there too. It's not, nothing's going to happen immediately, but it could say in 3 years. So that was sort of the sense I got, was this was sort of putting it together for that. And so I view it as, for sure, you've got 2 seasons, I think, where just about anything maybe could happen and everything's fine. But that, by that 2026 season, let's say, when John would be entering the final year of his contract, at that point, you'll have a pretty good idea how this is working. And that's when you kind of maybe make more decisions about where you're going. Do you keep sticking with kind of the team that's in place, or what do you do there? But yeah, I do think that allows them a little bit more, because that was going to be, if Pete had come back, that was definitely going to be the theme of next year, was they've got to do something a little bit more, right? Then Pete would be 73 and he's going to retire and is it. And so in some ways, I feel like, they might have just headed that off by doing it now, instead of having what could be a little bit of a year where it's just going to be a big referendum. And this is kind of just a weird analogy as well, but I think they felt that way with Russell. Like, they should have just traded him a year earlier instead of going through that last year with Russell. And, it's the old, then like the Bill Belichick, that was always the whole thing of cut a player a year early instead of a year late, that you're better off doing it that way. And so I think a little bit of this with Pete was probably that, like, instead of entering a year where that's going to be the focus of everybody in the off season of, especially let's say the 49ers win the Super Bowl and suddenly the Seahawks look like they're, and the Rams sort of look like they've righted the ship a little bit. And so they're going into this year that would be, that's what everybody would be, is the referendum on that. And, if they started 0-3 or something next year, we'd all be
don't sleep on the Cardinals over the next couple of years either.
Yeah. But I'm just saying, if, let's say, next year gotten off to a bad start, that you just spend the whole rest of that season just sort of, is Pete going to be back, and talking about all that. And you've sort of headed that off now by making the move now.
That's right.
Now it is just sort of turning to the future. And so everything now is about the next few years and kind of building it up that way. So, maybe they made this move a year earlier than they might have had to, or than they might have needed to. But I think they might have felt like there's some value in doing it that way. But yeah, I think that does allow them a little bit to play a little bit more that way too, instead of feeling like, if you get to week 7 next year or whatever, and suddenly that sort of decision comes, do we turn this position over to a rookie, or do we go sign some guy that's at least played for 5 years? Like, say with the Jason Peters thing this year, you go, that's literally signing the most experienced offensive lineman you could have found. And I don't know if he was a whole lot better than Stone Forsythe or whatever. But you could have just said, hey, we'll just play Stone Forsythe the rest of the year, or Anthony Bradford or whatever.
In some way, they were a victim of their 5-2 start, I think, this year.
Yeah. But you say that about head coaches, but assistant coaches are even more so. I mean, you talk to assistant coaches sometimes, and the whole idea of, well, let's groom guys for the future, and they can be like, man, my future is not secure past January or whatever. So, why do I care that much about doing things for, a future I may not be here for? It's always just such a win now. I mean, all pro sports are really that way, obviously, but they all know that it's just such a what have you done for me lately league. And so as fans, sometimes you do look at it more as like, doing that, kind of putting the team together for, let's make sure we're getting these guys experience for 2 or 3 years down the road. And that is what as you said, that's sort of the job of the front office to do that. The coaches usually are looking at, I'm the one who's going to be standing there in the rain on Sunday or whatever, if we're losing 40-0, the camera's panning on me. That's right. Sort of the guy who's failing here, and not the people in the front office who are up in the luxury boxes.
Yeah. That's an important distinction, man. That's an important distinction. I'm glad you mentioned it. you obviously cover the NFL for a living. You're clearly aware there's a big game coming up on Sunday, and I want to get your thoughts on that here in a second. But before we transition out of, Seahawksdom, before we zoom out, there are a couple of other recent coaching decisions that I think are worth getting your opinion on. One is bringing in Leslie Frazier as the assistant head coach, and someone that Macdonald has, considered a mentor for a while. They also hired Jay Harbaugh. One of the things about Mike Macdonald is that he's a Harbaugh guy. He has coached for both Harbaugh brothers and turned around both of their defenses. This is something Mike and I talked about last week. Mike astutely pointed out the incredible statistical improvement that both Harbaugh teams, Michigan and Baltimore, saw once he came on board in terms of points allowed, yards allowed, things like that. But now you got Leslie Frazier coming in and Jay Harbaugh as the special teams coordinator. How much should we look into that, those two hires in terms of, the worldview and the game plan that Mike Macdonald has?
Yeah, well, I think Leslie Frazier was really brought in part as sort of that sounding board, that older sort of guy who's been through just about everything I think that the NFL can hand you, and so he can be that guy that can just kind of guide Macdonald in a lot of ways that way. But yeah, I hadn't really realized how close they apparently got, but I think it was the 2016 season when Leslie Frazier was the defensive backs coach there, and then Macdonald was sort of his assistant and kind of really putting together that secondary. And they felt like they'd really made a big turn, and I saw some quotes from Leslie Frazier talking about that. About he gave a lot of credit to Macdonald for helping him with all that. So even though he left after that year for Buffalo, but that apparently they forged a really close relationship there. So obviously he's hired a lot of guys so far. Yeah, he has. He has some relationship with Jay Harbaugh. Had obviously been at Michigan, and obviously he's a Harbaugh. So, but then Oliver Dottie, who's apparently coming in as the linebackers coach, they've got some crossover time as well. So far he does seem to be putting together a staff that does include some people that he knows and has worked with before, and obviously feels comfortable with. The special teams thing is interesting. Larry Izzo, I thought did a really good job in general. You always special teams coaches always, probably rightly or wrongly, get judged so much by how well the field goal kicker does. And so obviously Jason Myers had a few misses this year, but that's so out of the special teams. Field goal kicking is so out of the special teams' hands. You sign a field goal kicker, and the Green Bay LaFleur got there was all the crap about the quote he gave, but I think he was just it was it was Green Bay, right, where he said every time he kicks it I pray or whatever. But I think that's how most coaches are with field goal kickers. It's like a closer in baseball. You just sign a guy and you got to write it with him typically. And
the closer in baseball is the perfect thing. Like, yeah, great if you can get Justin Tucker, aka Mariano Rivera, but for the most part, you're just hoping Bobby Ayala can get it done game to game.
There's no coaching kickers. You coach the whole team, but in terms of the kicker himself, you're not. The special teams coach isn't telling the kicker during the week how to kick the ball. You sign one of those guys and hope for the best. But my point there was Izzo. They've been really good in general. The punting team has been good. Their coverage has been fine, and you just have to take the return stuff in the context of nobody's returning great anymore with the way the rules are. But they've been above league average the last few years in a lot of those things. So so I thought Izzo might be a guy who had a chance to come back actually, but it's kind of interesting. Like I say, bringing in Jay Harbaugh as a guy he knows well.
Plus, when has a Harbaugh ever succeeded as a special teams coach in the NFL? Name one. You can't.
Yeah.
In all seriousness, I know that Jay Harbaugh has been pretty successful in his time at Michigan, but the second to last game he played, that Rose Bowl against Alabama, is one of the most hilariously awful special teams performances in totality that I've ever seen in my life.
Fair.
So
that's fair. Yeah. I think, to me, and Bob can correct me if I'm off base here, but it feels to me like the Harbaughs are the first family of football right now, right? They've won at every level, everywhere they go. They are synonymous with winning. If I'm a Chargers fan, I'm absolutely thrilled to get Jim in there. I think John is the top 3 head coach in the NFL. And so some of that's just got to be about bringing in winning DNA and tapping into that, especially since Mike Macdonald speaks the Harbaugh language. But, I mentioned a minute ago, and I do want to zoom out a little bit and talk about this game on Sunday. We're recording on Tuesday, which means that in 5 days, Kansas City Chiefs will play in the Super Bowl for the 4th time in 5 years, having won 2 of their previous 3 appearances. And one of those wins came against the San Francisco 49ers. They're back for revenge after consecutive come-from-behind victories in the playoffs. Now, traditionally, the Chiefs have gotten here on the back of their prolific offense, while the 49ers playoff runs over the last 15 years, been hallmarked by elite defense. Now, it's not like Casey's offense is bad per se, and San Francisco's defense has been very good, but neither of those are the main reasons they're back in the big game. The Chiefs' defense has been ridiculous. The Niners are breaking the mold for offensive efficiency. Bob, when you look at this game, just as a football fan that is blessed with the knowledge that you get from covering the sport for a living, what stands out to you the most when you look at this game?
Well, one of the interesting things to me about this is it feels like these are 2 teams that showed a lot more vulnerability during the year than you often get. I mean, so many times in a Super Bowl, there's some team that just, they kind of obviously got there. They just kind of cruised to it. But, you forget the 49ers had that 3-game losing streak, and the Seahawks were in first place in the NFC
That's
West
right.
going into November. Before that game at Baltimore, they were in first place. I mean, it was kind of a semantics because it was by a half game because they hadn't had their bye yet. The 49ers have played one more game or whatever, but still, they kind of looked suddenly real vulnerable there, and they had some injuries. And then the Chiefs, just spent half this year with, kind of what's wrong with the Chiefs offense because it doesn't look as good as it had in the past. Mahomes wasn't putting up quite the same numbers and all that. And if the Chiefs really, got this and won 2 in a row, they would seem like one of the least impressive teams to ever win 2 in a row. When you think about all the teams that have like the going way back, like the Dolphins undefeated team, or the Lombardi Packers, and some of these the Cowboys, the Jimmy Johnson era Cowboys and stuff like that, and these Chiefs don't necessarily seem like they're quite that to level of historical dominance, which is part of why I'm thinking the 49ers are going to win, because I just sort of feel like maybe it finally is their time. I know they haven't looked great in the playoffs, but they did get there, and they wouldn't be the first team ever to maybe not be super dominant in the playoffs and then get there and win the Super Bowl once they got there. So I don't know. I sort of feel like it's their time, but that's where the quarterback matchup. This is such a fascinating quarterback matchup between Mahomes, who I don't think anybody questions is going to go down as one of the top 5 or 10 quarterbacks of all time, and then Brock Purdy, who a lot of people now aren't even sure he's one of the best 10 quarterbacks currently in the NFL. That he's just kind of riding the coattails of the offense. So it'll be incredibly interesting to see it that way. But I think it's a fascinating matchup in a lot of those ways because of kind of the narratives that each of these teams sort of brings into the game, and a little bit of the uneven seasons. Like the Chiefs lost to the Raiders on Christmas Day, right? I mean, they didn't look very good in that game at all. Probably got Antonio Pierce hired by the Raiders with that performance, but then go on the road and win those 2 games the way they did, suddenly look like that. So maybe they're one of these teams that's kind of these veteran Super Bowl teams that's turning it on at the right time. But I'm going to go with the 49ers to win it. I just kind of feel like maybe they're sort of due to win it with and when they played well this year, which they didn't always do, but I thought they had stretches where they did look like the best team in the NFL for some significant stretches of time.
No question.
And if they play like that, I think they're the better team.
Okay, yeah. So I'm curious. So you've got the 49ers. The way that I look at it, actually, before I tell you the way that I look at it, I want to get your thoughts on this. When you look at the matchups here, what do you think the Chiefs' best matchup in this game is, and what do you think the 49ers' best matchup of the game is? Like, if you were putting together the game plan for each team, what are you trying to lean into?
Well, and what's interesting is, the Seahawks were pretty open later about the one matchup they thought they had on the 49ers was their receivers against the 49ers corners. They thought the 49ers corners were the kind of the one vulnerable part of that defense. And that was why, Pete was pretty frank afterward about kind of the protection issues. And if we just could have protected a little bit better, they thought they could get DK and Smith and Jigba and Lockett and stuff like that in some good positions to really take advantage of some things. And so I would probably lean on that a little bit and just think that that's, if you can block just well enough. I think Mahomes throwing the ball against some of the guys in the San Francisco secondary, I think that's a matchup I would like for them. And San Francisco's best, I think getting McCaffrey going, and Kansas City's defensive line obviously has played really well at times, and they just did it. It was almost inexplicable how little in some ways Baltimore tried to attack it with the run, but I think San Francisco is going to do that in this one and try to work all the different avenues of their running game, not just McCaffrey, but the stuff they do with Deebo Samuel and stuff like that, and try to get Kansas City off their game a little bit there. So that would be the one thing to me that I know that there's always the whole, you only end up rushing for a lot of yards if you're doing well anyway. But I do feel like this is one of those games where if the 49ers get to that like 150-yard rushing mark or something like that, if they're proving that they can do that, then I think that's a real key for them. Because I don't think, despite I kind of think Brock Purdy's better than a lot of people do, but I still don't think this is a game where you want Brock Purdy having to win it for you.
Well, yeah, that's just it. So, follow-up question: does this strike you as a high-scoring game or a low-scoring game?
I think it'd be a medium scoring, like 24 to 20, that sort of thing. I don't even know what the over-under is. I guess I should know that. So I don't know if like 44 would be where that stands on that. But I would. It strikes me it's going to be that. It's not going to be like that Patriots-Rams one. I don't think it'll be that. I think there'll be some points scored in this, but I don't think it'll be like the Eagles Super Bowl, the Eagles-Patriots Super Bowl or whatever. I think it'll be somewhere in between those, because each of these obviously are good defenses in general, and the 49ers, their front seven, which another thing that's been, mysterious at times, that the 49ers haven't been a little bit better with their front. And again, I know that was one of the things that disappointed the Seahawks, because they did feel like that was, I think they thought they could have held up a little bit better against the 49ers front to get the passing game going a little bit more in those games, which, I think there was some question at times with Seattle's game plan in those, but I think they did really want to try to throw the ball against them. And, But so I think the Chiefs will have some success moving it, but I think it'll be somewhere in that. Yeah, if I had to pick, I'd say something like 24 to 20 49ers.
Yeah, and look, you're right in the vicinity. The over/under is 47.5. I think the average NFL game this year at 45 points. So they're expecting just a touch over that. It's so interesting, because I actually think the Chiefs defense matches up against the 49ers offense really, really well. And look, we've just seen Steve Spagnuolo's defense shut down the best offenses all season long. And, they've had some hiccups, but the 49ers have really struggled against the best defenses in the NFL this year. They did not play well against Cleveland. They did not play well against Baltimore. They did not play well against Cincinnati. These are the teams they struggled against, and the Chiefs defense is every bit as good as all of them, and they're healthy. The one big weakness that the Chiefs have had, in fact, the only thing that I'm aware of that they are near the bottom in the NFL at, is defending zone scheme running. I think they're like 31st out of 32 teams in terms of defending that. And that's obviously the Shanahan system is zone scheme running. You've got the best running back on the planet, taking all those carries. The question for me is, can Kyle Shanahan resist the urge to pass a bunch? Because he's gotten himself in a hole in each of the first two playoff games by passing a lot, by putting the ball in Brock Purdy's hands and saying, go get us a lead. And he hasn't been able to do that. And then, of course, down the stretch, that all clicked. I don't think the Packers or Lions defense are in the same universe as the Chiefs defense in terms of pass, covering the pass and putting pressure on the quarterback. I think the way the 49ers win is if Shanahan can stay disciplined and just hammer the rock, old school football, right? The the type of football that makes my dad happy is what I think it's going to take, because the end of the day, you do have Brock Purdy, and he's such a lightning rod for discourse on quarterback play, and that's its own conversation. We could do a whole show on that. But it's Patrick Mahomes on the other side. You know what I mean? Like, there's a huge delta there. I don't think anybody, even the most diehard 49er fan, is going to argue that there's a big delta in pure talent between Patrick Mahomes and Brock Purdy at the game's most important position. The way that I look at games and the way that I approach betting on football is I do a likelihood quadrant, right? Like, okay, yeah, sure, you might have a medium score differential where it's somewhere in that 6 to 10 point range. But generally speaking, you've got 4 outcomes. You've got a close 49ers win, a big 49ers win, a close Chiefs win, and a big Chiefs win. And I think the likelihood of a close 49ers win is a little bit more than the likelihood of a close Chiefs win, just because I think they have a better roster. I do think it's more likely that the Chiefs win big than it is that the 49ers win big. And I think that does come down to the intangible championship mentality, knowing how to win. I think it actually helps the Chiefs that they actually have lost a Super Bowl and bookended that loss with Super Bowl wins. I think a huge under-discussed variable in that Chiefs Super Bowl loss was what happened with Andy Reid's son a day or two before the Super Bowl, right? He had a drunk driving incident that I believe took a life. Dealing with that. They also dropped 9 passes in that game, which was insane. I mean, Mahomes had the best 9-point game of any quarterback in NFL history in that game. And they made their adjustments. The Eagles defense was exceptional last year and they dropped 34 on them. So to me, I do think it's the Chiefs. That's where my money will be, but I don't, I would say you play this game 100 times, the Chiefs win at like 52 of those times. And I'm going to lean on that. But if I were to say that you had to bet $10,000 of your own money right now on who wins the game, even money, you're putting it on the 49ers?
Yeah, I guess so. You're making me question myself there now with all that, but
well,
but
good.
Yeah,
That's hey, man. We can have opinions evolve in real time here.
Yeah, no, I think I would, but I was thinking while you were saying that, we all know the whole Shanahan, you talking about Shanahan staying disciplined with what he does. And we all know the other key with Shanahan is that whole scripted play thing. And, if it's 15 or 20, or I don't think he's ever said exactly how many it is. But there's no question. I always watch these Seahawks games and some of my coworkers, because I'd always be like, what the 49ers are going to gain like 180 yards in the first 20 minutes of every game they ever play against the Seahawks. The question is whether the Seahawks can force them to kick field goals, or maybe even, as happened with Garoppolo all the time, they would get an interception or two here or there. And if you could hold that off and not trail 21-0 or whatever at the end of that thing, because it always felt like clockwork in Seahawks games where the 49ers would put up, they would just drive the field the first 3 times they got the ball, but it was how many points they got out of those drives. And if you could survive that a little bit, it always felt like the game evened out a little bit in the second half. Obviously, the playoff game a couple years ago was not that way, where the Seahawks had the lead, or I think in the third quarter, if I recall right, in the wild card.
Yeah, they had that long DK Metcalf touchdown right before the half. They were up 17-16, and then it just got the doors blown off in the second half.
But a lot of these other ones, it always felt like if you could just kind of weather that storm a little bit, it would even out somewhat. And so I think that's really huge in this one because, again, for all those reasons, the Chiefs are the team that, since you've won a couple Super Bowls, you're playing on house money a little bit. I mean, it's not like every guy's sitting there like, oh man, if we don't win this one, what's our legacy going to be or whatever. I mean, Travis Kelce and Mahomes and all those guys already have a few rings. So, and it's the 49ers who are kind of a little bit more at the other end of that, where they'd been to the conference title game 3 straight years, right? And then this is the first time they actually got over the hump to at least get into the Super Bowl. So, they maybe feel like the team that's got a little bit more to lose, and the team that's got to do some things early to, they were able to come back against Detroit. I mean, they had all that same stuff kind of, I guess, going through their minds, I'm sure, at halftime of the Detroit game, and they were able to come back against that one. But that was against a team that, had won one playoff.
I just don't see the Chiefs. If the Chiefs get a lead the way that the Packers and the Lions did, the Chiefs aren't aren't wired
No.
to cough that up. They're not going to be dropping passes.
Yeah.
They're not going to be dropping interceptions. They're not going to be making dumb coaching decisions, you know,
And
the way
Mahomes
that I
won't do
think the
something
Lions and the
stupid
Packers
either.
did.
Yeah.
Well, that's just it, man. But I will say, you know, I'm fond of saying on this show, I'm a football fan first, a Seahawks fan second. And as a football fan, this is a great Super Bowl. I mean, just a great Super Bowl.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it's a fascinating matchup for all those. I thought any of the four, anything that could have come out of those four, I thought was going to be really good. I thought it was.
Totally.
I thought the championship Sunday was really fun. I thought both those games. I was really looking forward to them all week, and kind of just watched every play of both those very intently because I thought that both those matchups were really fascinating to me. If you got, you know, Buffalo and Detroit Detroit obviously finally in there at all, but Buffalo, you know, we all know their tortured history. So if they'd have somehow gotten in there, and you know, Baltimore with Buffalo wasn't in the champion, but I just mean the playoffs as a whole. But Baltimore, you know, with Lamar and them not having, I guess, you know, I think kind of feeling a little bit like they haven't taken full advantage of everything they've sort of been able to put together the last few years for a variety of reasons, and so them not getting there. So I thought it's been a fun playoffs getting to this point. So I agree, but you know, I think in general Baltimore sort of looked like the best team in the NFL for a lot of the year, but otherwise I feel like these are two of the three other, you know, I kind of felt like there were maybe the three teams that sort of felt like they spent parts of the year looking like the best teams in the NFL maybe, and I think these are two of those three.
I'm 100% with you, man. Like I said, as a football fan, this is a beautiful matchup. And I do think there are some real legacies on the line here. Listen, Bob, this has been awesome, man. I know you tried real hard to join us last week when the Macdonald news broke, but obviously something like that throws your schedule into a blender. So we are super grateful that you made the time.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, no, I felt bad. I just was there was so much going on. It was going to be hard to know. I could just devote an hour and where I was at some of those moments. So, but yeah, I'm glad things slowed down enough we were able to do it.
Well, listen, an hour a year time talking ball is worth its weight in gold. So we really, really appreciate it. Before we let you get out of here, just last thing, where can the folks listening who for some reason don't know where they can find more of your stuff, where can they get it?
Yeah, it's pretty easy these days. Just SeattleTimes.com, and everything is there. I know we have several different subscription models or whatever. So there's a lot of different ways you can get our stuff. But obviously we cover a lot of everything. But you know, and then Twitter as well. I always try to link to everything I do there. So you know, Twitter is just @bcondotta. So BCON. DOTTA, so everything else is there. So that's about the only two places we really put everything anymore.
All right, y'all. That's going to do it for today. As always, you can find Mike and I on social media as well. I am on Twitter at @JacksonBevins. That's JACSON. Remember that no K is okay when spelling my name. Mike is on Twitter at Mike Barwin, and the show itself is @Cigar Thoughts. You can catch full video episodes on our YouTube channel @Cigar Thoughts and find the rest of our socials at cigarthoughtsnfl.com. This episode is brought to you by Westland Distillery in Seattle, which is my favorite local whiskey maker. If you're watching on YouTube, you've seen me enjoying a glass of their new Tub Thumper Cask Exchange, which is smooth as hell and has a unique finish. Westland is an American single malt whiskey distillery in the Soto neighborhood of Seattle. Their tasting room and bar are open to the public, where they serve whiskey flights, cocktails, and small plates. There's a bottle shop on site featuring distillery exclusive releases and more, located at 2931 First Avenue, a little over a mile south of Lumen Field. And as you know, if you've been listening to this show, their Garyana No. 8 was just named the No. 3 whiskey in the entire world by Whiskey Advocate. Needless to say, I'm stoked to be working with them, and one of the reasons I love their whiskey so much is that they're excellent pairings with a good cigar. And speaking of, we do have our own special release of cigars that you can purchase at a terrific price as a listener of the show. Until now, you've been able to order your own bundle of 10 for just $169, which is less than half of what this blend sells for in cigars on the open market. But because of the success of the Cigar Thoughts release, we lowered the price to just $149, and we've decided to keep it there. That's right, only $149 for a bundle of 10. As many of you know, we partnered with one of the most prestigious cigar manufacturers in the world to release these official Cigar Thoughts cigars, which you can order directly from cigarthoughtsnfl.com. Just follow the link on the show page to get these easy-to-smoke stogies rolled with 13-year age premium Dominican tobacco leaf, or hit us up on Twitter and Instagram. We'll send you the details directly. And the cigars, they come with a Bovita humidification pack and a Mylar storage bag to make sure they stay fresh whether you have a humidor or not. Of course, you can listen to this show and read every article at fieldgoals.com. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and you like the show, drop us a 5-star rating and leave a quick review. Thank you to all of y'all listening for your continued support of the show. You know you've only got so much time for podcasts in your life. It's an honor to be a part of that for y'all. Please know that by sharing this show on social media and with your friends, you give us the juice to keep making this happen. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, onwards and upwards, my friends.